Officials have just released age progression images of convicts who escaped Alcatraz more than 60 years ago.
Fog rolled across San Francisco Bay that night, thick enough to swallow sound. Inside America's most secure prison, 3 men lay perfectly still in their beds. Or at least, that's what the guards believed. By morning, Alcatraz, the prison designed to erase hope, had been outwitted. No alarms, no bodies, no answers. For decades, officials said the ocean finished the job. But in 2025, scientists say the water may have done the opposite. What if the most famous prison break in history didn't end in death, but in silence? Alcatraz was never meant to be escaped. That was the point. Rising from the cold water of San Francisco Bay, the island didn't just hold prisoners, it held certainty. The certainty that once you arrived, you were finished. No roads, no trees, just rock, steel, and water that never forgave mistakes. Officials called it a prison. Inmates called it the end. The bay did the rest of the work. The water was always cold. The currents never stopped moving. Some nights, fog erased the shoreline completely, like the world itself had stepped back. Even strong swimmers feared it. Even boats respected it. For decades, that fear became policy. Guards didn't have to say escape was impossible. The island said it for them. Every cell faced the same truth. Freedom was visible, but unreachable. San Francisco's lights flickered just far enough away to feel cruel. That image mattered, because Alcatraz wasn't just holding men, it was holding a promise that the system worked, that there were places so secure, so final, that defiance ended there. And for 29 years, that promise held. No confirmed escapes, no proven survivors, only silence, followed by the same official answer every time. They didn't make it. Then, one quiet night in June 1962, something went wrong. Not loudly, not violently, but precisely. By the time anyone noticed, the myth had already cracked. And once a myth cracks, it never seals the same way again. Because the next question isn't how the prison failed, it's who was patient enough to wait for it to fail. The night Alcatraz failed did not sound like a failure. There were no alarms, no shouts, no gunfire echoing across the water. Just routine. Guards walked their rounds the way they always had, boots on concrete, keys at their sides, flashlights sweeping across rows of metal bars. Inside the cells, 3 men appeared to be asleep. Blankets rose, pillows held shape. Nothing moved. Head count passed. Somewhere between 10:30 and 11 p.m., the island exhaled and didn't notice. By morning, the island felt different. A guard stopped at one cell longer than usual. Something looked wrong. The body in the bed didn't shift. The face didn't react. When the blanket was pulled back, it cracked against the floor. The head was fake. Within minutes, the truth spread through the cell house. Frank Morris was gone. So were John and Clarence Anglin. 3 cells, 3 absences, no signs of struggle, no broken locks. The impossible had happened quietly. Searchlights cut across the bay, boats moved fast, orders were shouted, but the water answered with nothing. No bodies surfaced, no cries carried back. Officials leaned on the only explanation that made sense. They drowned. They had to. Because the alternative, that 3 inmates slipped through America's most secure prison and vanished, was unthinkable. Yet the facts refused to cooperate.
No bodies were recovered. No clear wreckage at first. Only fragments, days later, drifting where answers should have been. And beneath the urgency, another question began to form, one no one wanted to ask. If they drowned, why did Alcatraz look so untouched? And what kind of escape leaves no noise behind? Frank Morris was not supposed to be on Alcatraz. The prison was built for men who broke rules, not men who studied them. But Morris didn't just break rules, he mapped them. He watched patterns, he listened longer than others. And wherever he had been locked up before, he had eventually found a way out. That was why he was sent to the Rock. Officials saw a repeat offender, a troublemaker, someone who escaped too often. What they didn't see was patience. Morris had learned early that force drew attention, stillness did not. By the time he arrived on Alcatraz in 1960, the island was already aging. Salt air had been eating at the walls for decades. Concrete cracked in quiet places, metal thinned where no one looked twice. Morris noticed. He was placed in a cell near two brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. They talked at night, softly, when the prison believed them asleep, about the bay, about the routines, about how long guards lingered, about what the prison ignored. This was not hope. This was observation. Morris didn't rush. He didn't test limits. He waited. Days became months. Months became preparation. Every move was small enough to disappear inside routine. To Alcatraz, nothing had changed, but beneath the sinks, behind the walls, and inside the men themselves, something was taking shape. Not a breakout, not yet, a rehearsal. Because Morris understood something the prison didn't. Alcatraz wasn't watching for intelligence, it was watching for noise. And when escape finally came, it wouldn't arrive as chaos, it would arrive as silence. The question wasn't whether Morris had a plan, it was how long he'd been perfecting it. John and Clarence Anglin had learned something long before Alcatraz. You survive together, or you don't survive at all. They grew up poor, one of 13 children, sharing work, meals, and silence. By the time they were adults, that bond had hardened into instinct. When one moved, the other followed. When one planned, the other finished the thought. Prison never broke that rhythm. It sharpened it. Officials saw two bank robbers with escape histories. What they missed was coordination. On Alcatraz, the brothers were placed in cells beside Frank Morris. At night, when the lights dimmed and the island listened only to itself, plans passed quietly between walls. The Anglins became the hands. They gathered materials where no one looked twice, from work details, from scraps, from routines designed to keep men busy, not creative. Nothing they took looked dangerous on its own. That was the point. What mattered most wasn't what they built, it was what they hid. Day after day, the cells looked unchanged. Vent covers stayed in place, walls appeared solid, guards passed without stopping. Alcatraz believed what it wanted to see. And then there were the heads. They were never meant to last forever, just long enough. Placed carefully on pillows, shaped to hold the right shadows, they did their job while the real men prepared to disappear. Not run, not fight, disappear. The Anglins understood timing better than anyone. You didn't rush a system like Alcatraz. You waited for it to check its watch and look away. By the time the prison noticed anything wrong, the brothers were already somewhere they were never supposed to be. And if loyalty had carried them that far, what else had it carried them through? Alcatraz was built to feel permanent.
Steel bars, thick walls, narrow cells, everything designed to last longer than the men inside it. But time works quietly. and salt water works faster. Behind the sinks in the cells, the concrete had been weakening for years, not enough to draw attention, just enough to crumble when pressed slowly. Night after night the damage grew, but only where no one bothered to look closely. The prison saw walls, the men saw seams. Every day the illusion reset. Cardboard covers slid back into place, painted surfaces blended into gray stone. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, a passage was forming. Sound was the risk, so sound was buried. Music hour filled the cell house with noise that guards stopped listening to. An accordion wheezed, notes bent. Beneath it, something else moved, something deliberate. Above the cells, an unused space waited, old, unwatched, forgotten by a prison that trusted its reputation more than its maintenance. Up there, the men built what couldn't exist, tools from scraps, parts from nothing, solutions from patience. Alcatraz had rules for violence. It had rules for rebellion. It had no rules for imagination. By the time the final night came, the escape wasn't happening in the open. It was happening inside the prison's blind spots, places that only existed because everyone believed escape was impossible. And that belief did most of the guarding. Because when a system believes it cannot fail, it stops checking how close it already is. Above the cells, beneath the roof, 3 men waited for the island to look away one last time. And beyond that roof was water, cold, moving, unforgiving, which was exactly why no one thought they'd choose it. San Francisco Bay had always been Alcatraz's final guard. The water stayed cold year-round. Currents twisted without warning. Even strong swimmers struggled to stay straight, let alone reach shore. For decades, this was the unspoken rule. You didn't need higher walls when the bay did the killing for you. That's why officials were calm at first. If Morris and the Anglin brothers had made it off the island, the water would handle the rest. It always had. But the bay didn't behave the way it was expected to. In the days after the escape, fragments appeared, a paddle, pieces of material, a sealed bundle of personal items that hadn't sunk. Nothing conclusive, but nothing final either. Years later, scientists would revisit that night with tools the prison never had. They looked at tides, at wind, at timing, and what they found was uncomfortable. The currents on that night didn't pull straight out to sea. For a narrow window, less than an hour, they moved sideways, toward land, toward Angel Island, not fast, not gentle, but possible. Cold water models showed something else. With flotation, survival time stretched, minutes became hours, effort mattered less than direction. Then there was the raft. Fragments recovered were missing a key piece, the valve. Without it, the raft wouldn't fail by accident. It would be deflated on purpose. Which raised a question no report answered. If the raft broke apart naturally, why remove the one thing keeping it alive? The bay was still dangerous, still lethal, but danger isn't certainty, and certainty was the one thing Alcatraz had always relied on. If the water didn't finish the job, where did the story actually end? For years, the official answer stayed the same. They drowned. The case was closed. The island moved on. But stories don't always listen to paperwork.
In 2013, a letter arrived quietly at a police department in San Francisco. It didn't demand attention. It didn't threaten. It simply claimed something impossible, that the escape had worked. The letter said the men survived the bay, that they lived quietly, that time had finally caught up with them. One name was signed at the bottom, John Anglin. Authorities tested it. Handwriting, prints, DNA, nothing confirmed it. Nothing erased it either. The letter sat in an uncomfortable place between truth and nuisance. Then older claims resurfaced. Family members spoke of postcards arriving from far away, of money sent south, of a photograph taken years later, two men standing in Brazil, older, thinner, unmistakably familiar. Officials called it coincidence, families called it proof. And then there was the problem of the bodies. San Francisco Bay gives things back, it always has. Yet no remains were ever found, not then, not later, not even when search areas were expanded. That absence became louder with time, so loud, in fact, that the case refused to stay closed. By 2022, new images were released, faces aged forward, imagined into the present, not because officials believed they were alive, but because they couldn't prove they weren't. The escape had stopped being just a question of survival. It had become a question of belief. And belief has a way of bending evidence to fit its shape. By 2025, the question wasn't emotional anymore. It was mechanical. Scientists rebuilt the night of the escape piece by piece, tides mapped down to the minute, wind layered over water, cold exposure measured against flotation, not guesses, models. And the models did something unsettling. They opened a path. If the raft launched during a narrow window, less than 60 minutes, the currents wouldn't fight the men. They would carry them, not out to sea, but across. The bay, once thought of as a wall, behaved more like a moving road. That didn't mean survival was guaranteed. It meant it was possible. And possibility changes history. The raft design, once dismissed as crude, suddenly mattered. Its size, its shape, its missing valve, pieces that looked like failure now looked like intent. Even the fog mattered, thick enough to hide movement, thin enough to navigate by sound. Science didn't prove they lived, but it erased the certainty that they died. And in doing so, it shifted the burden of truth, because if escape was physically achievable, then drowning was no longer the default answer. Alcatraz had relied on inevitability, on the idea that nature finished what walls began. But nature doesn't enforce rules, it responds to timing. The prison is a museum now. Tourists walk past empty cells, they stare at the beds, the walls, the vents. What they don't see is the moment when the system blinked. And whether 3 men stepped into the water to die or into history to disappear depends on a single question science still refuses to answer. What happens when preparation meets the one night the impossible loosens its grip?